Very small boys don't know how to use it.
Yeah, well,
All
one
right,
guy
so-
at work and told him to come on.
All right. Okay, we got an interview with an employer here. We're gonna start out with this, and then we're gonna do a war story. And we're gonna go ahead and say, whether the question here, this is starting with question 3, but it doesn't matter. We're talking about an employer that's asking me what to expect out of people that he's thinking about hiring. Does this person do quality work? What I mean, do they leave things loose, wire harnesses unanchored, parts swinging that are supposed to be mounted and secured? Do they make sure the car is clean when it's returned? Do they do their paperwork properly? Do they fiddle with the customer's radio or plunder in the glove box in the console? Can I count on them not to steal from the customer? Okay, now that is your little, oh yeah, I gotta give you your answer sheet so you can write this down about yourself. Okay. How's that fun?
Messing with the radio. Justin leadership. Me losing bolts, don't let it go.
Rich. All right, make sure everybody gets one of those. All right, there we go. All right, so that one there. If this is, think about all these questions right here when you're filling out your paperwork, all right, that I'm giving you over there. It's gonna be a test here. Does they do quality work? It's what people expect. Now, is your name here dependable? I got a busy shop. I need to know I can count on this person to be in the service bay, ready to go to work at 7:30. That's when work starts. Have you been able to count on this trainee to show up on time every day and go right to work? I need an honest answer. Now, if I'm, one of the things that I can't do is lie this saying, yes, this person has been very dependable. You can count on them to do everything they start out to do. I say, well, I don't know, this person here, okay. When this person is in the shop and has been assigned to work, are they self-motivated in accomplishing the work, or do you have to continue to prod them in order to get them to finish their work? How much time do they spend on breaks and talking instead of working? I need people that not only know how to do the work, but I have the great motivation to get the work done with minimum supervision. I don't need slackers. Is this person a slacker? So would you consider yourself a slacker? Got to be honest here now. Finally, how are their troubleshooting skills? Can they figure out what's wrong, or will I have to do it for them? I don't have time to run the shop, schedule work, talk to customers, do the troubleshooting too. I need a competent, self-motivated, self-sufficient technician with a full set of mental troubleshooting and critical thinking skills. They need to own their own tools so as not to have to borrow from the other guys in the shop.
I have my thoughts.
How about that? Okay, think about those questions. Now we go into the war story.
All right.
What'll it take? Once one of my students replaced the engine in his 20-year-old high-mileage car. He did all the work himself, spent a big chunk of money in the process. All the parts had to be purchased through the school, and then he blamed it on me when his in-tank fuel pump died a few days later. Had nothing to do with the work that he did in here, but he blamed it on me like it was my fault. And I said, who worked on the car? He said, well, I worked on the car. So why is it my fault that your fuel pump went out? I mean, he was basically here to get his car fixed, not have to learn how to work. In other words, he didn't want to learn how to fix cars. He just wanted his car fixed. And that was the only semester he was in here. That was a long time ago. There was a student from another department came to me with a power window problem, and we checked it, but when I gave her a price on the replacement part, she lost interest really fast. Well, that particular one was pretty expensive. She was expecting it to say, hey, for $5 we can fix it, and that kind of thing. So a lot of people were expecting something. Well, this is a good customer. And can I count on him not to play with his cell phone when he's supposed to be listening? Okay.
He's playing with that
For
cell phone.
instance, we did an engine swap on an 88 Honda CRX, had a good engine, had been flipped, a replacement vehicle. This was the one that, and this was a replacement vehicle. This car had a bad engine, this car had a good engine, but it had been flipped over, and he had purchased another 88 CRX, but the crashed CRX was a 1.6 liter SI, while the replacement vehicle was a 1.5 liter DX with a different type of fuel injection. Is this a problem? We're going to have to pull the engine out of this yellow car and put it in the blue car, and the fuel injection is different.
You could probably just take the fuel injection off the yellow car and put it on.
What would that entail? If we were going to take the fuel injection off the yellow car and put it on the blue car, what would we have to do to make that happen?
Change the computer out,
Computer, what else?
maybe the wire harness.
Wire harness out. Is that an easy job?
No, you could put a,
Is there a better way? Somebody give me a better way.
could you, well,
What's wrong with it now?
will the injection system off the blue car fit on the yellow car?
No, the blue car is actually got throttle body injection, and the yellow car,
Can you change the intake over and make it throttle body?
I expect you could probably strip it down to a long block take the engine out of the yellow car and take everything off of it so that it's a long block with the pan, the head, and all that. Drop it in the car and yeah, put your manifolds on there. That way you've got the blue car with its original fuel injection. You haven't had to change the wire harness. You haven't had to change the computer. You haven't had to worry about leaving grounds unhooked somewhere that you didn't know about. A lot of better ways to do things. Initially it seemed like, well, we got to swap all these wires over. We didn't have to do much. We just opened the manifolds up, we dropped that motor in there and all that. This was the funny one right here though. And when we spun it over, it sounded fairly normal. But I says, let's check it to see if it'll start. It wouldn't start. So I said, let's check the compression on it. Well, number 4 didn't have any compression, but it also didn't have any cylinder leakage. So how can it, remember I talked about this before, how can it have no compression and no cylinder leakage?
The cylinder walls is dry.
No, I mean, it's got no compression, but it's got no cylinder leakage.
I know, but it's a
If the cylinder walls are dry, it'll have cylinder leakage. Right? Past the rings. But it didn't have that.
One of the valves is stuck closed.
No. Well, that's not a bad thought. I mean, I get your point on that. But basically what had happened was somebody had been doing the revving this thing up and it threw a rod and then it busted the rod off and knocked a hole in the block and threw it out on the highway and then the crank would still turn normally. But the piston was just in there. The piston was just in the bottom of there and it wasn't moving. So if the piston's not moving, you ain't got no compression.
You talking about before you put the motor in there?
No, this was the one we were gonna pull out of this and it was a bad motor.
Oh.
Yeah. All right, so the yellow car had 1.6 liter MFI, the blue car had 1.5 liter TBI. So we pulled the engine from a crashed car, stripped it down to a long block, stuffed it in the good car. He now had a 1.6 liter engine with TBI. In the end, we made it happen with $425 worth of parts. And it's really something how fast the little things can add up on a repair order. But even I was surprised at how high the parts bill was. But he never even blinked. He just wrote a check and drove away happy as he could be. He just took a paint with that thing. All right, so now we've got the tempo. The tempo was much fun. Take your notes now. You got notes, you got to turn those notes in for a grade. Okay, you got a 94 Ford Tempo, 198,349 miles, drive lanes, 2.3 liter engine, ATX, automatic transaxle, complaint with the transmission makes noise in reverse. Now those were some of the toughest engines that anybody ever built. That engine that was in that little car right there. Cast iron cylinder head, camshaft in the block. You know, just like, it's built like half of a V8, but it's standing up straight. And I've seen them things get so hot they make the thermostat turn blue and still not burn oil or blow a gasket or anything. Now if you run them with that oil long enough, they'll eventually come apart like any other car. But anyway, well, I sat down in the car and started it up. There were noises coming from everywhere. You ever get in one like that you were just plumb scared to drive it because everything on the car seemed like it was falling apart? The car was a tow truck right away from the boneyard and there was more wrong with it than there was right. It was just a disaster. Now keep that in mind, all right? It did start and could be driven down the road. The front and rear engine mounts were both separated. The powertrain was trying to jump out of the car every time we put it in forward or reverse. It was a needs everything job. Plus it's making these noises. The transmission was making noise, the engine was making noise, but hey, we're in here learning how to do stuff, so this would be a good thing. We weren't going to go after the engine noise because she was more concerned about the popping noise coming from the transmission when she put it in reverse. Our initial focus was on the transmission noise. And there was a little peculiar popping sound that came from the transmission in reverse, just like she said. You put it in reverse, you go to back up, and you hear it pop, 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 pop. Strange noise. Hadn't heard anything like that before or since. It had the frequency of something dragging against the park pawl wheel. So I figured, well, we'll adjust the gear selector just in case the park pawl lever is dragging against it or something, but that wasn't what it was. So we pulled the transmission oil pin. This is what we found in there. That ball, well, several balls in there, but that one ball had dimpled itself into that part of the pan. And I'll show you a picture in a minute. The park pawl had found that thing and had managed to beat it into a little dimple in the pan so that every time you put it in reverse, it would roll that ball back against this thing and it would oil can that transmission oil pan. Pop, 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 pop. It's just funny as all get out how that thing did that. So the park pawl whirls really near the pan. Now on those tempos, on those ATX transmissions, the valve body is on top, not on the bottom. And so basically on this one here, all you got when you look up in there, and I'll show you that in a minute, is you basically are seeing your final drive and that kind of thing. So it's unusual, the filters there and all that. And incidentally too, on this one here, the pump is in the back of the transmission, not close to the engine. It's got a ride going through there. Real interesting how that goes. Now the ball had machined itself a nice little dimple, and that's what I was talking about over here. And there, see those teeth on that park pawl? Now this is what you see when you pull the pan off one of them. And all that, you see basically the final drive up in here, the valve body's up on the top. So getting to the valve body's a little aggravating, but pulling the pan off down there. Incidentally, I had one time, and I told about it in transmission class, that this gear right here wore out on it to the point to where on one side it's driving the speedometer output, and on the other side it's driving the governor. And the governor basically, spins faster and faster, and the fly weights go out, and it moves a little, it revalves on the inside, and it shifts to the next gear. This one wouldn't shift. I said, well, that must have something to do with the governor. I popped the little thing out, pull the governor out, threw another one down in there, and it shifted fine for a week, and then it came back, and it turned out its gear was loose on there. It's supposed to be retained by that bearing when you press it on the end. And so I managed to get that final drive out of there and replace that gear and put it back together where it wouldn't do that anymore. And I did it in like an hour and a half, and it paid like 6 hours because they said you had to pull the transmission out to do it, so I made some good money on that job. Well, in the forward direction though, the pawl would move the ball to the back of its dimple, and it would produce no noise going in that direction. So it was so bad that our clear choice was to sell the student on a good salvage yard transmission, rear main engine oil seal, and some new engine mounts, and she agreed, and we found a good one for $400. Now her bill is going to be pretty strong because $400 plus 20% plus tax, and then we've got our motor mounts we're going to have to buy and all that kind of thing, so she's not going to get by particularly cheap, but we are going to have a transmission that doesn't make noise. All right, that's what it looks like when you have a transmission. Now right here is where the governor goes. See, when you're standing up there, you can reach down there and pop this off. It reminds you of a GM transmission. The valve body's under this pan up here. This is the pump over here, and of course that side over bolts the motor. This one's sort of laying on the concrete, but somebody took a picture of it like that. And the pan that we just saw in was like this, and the axle shafts go in right here. But I used to like them. I used to rebuild those, and I sort of enjoyed it. But the ATX was used in the Tempos and Escorts seemed to be a lot more cooperative than some of the other units I was building. In other words, you didn't have any trouble typically building one of those, or you could if you didn't do everything just right. If you reverse the valve body gaskets, for example, you wouldn't have any reversed. It was strange on that. So, all right. There were a lot of valves in the A4LD. Now the Bronco 2s and the Rangers and stuff, and some of the other ones had A4LD transmission in them, which is kind of like a 4R55E, like what we got in our Ranger. And look at all the valves in that valve body. Cleaning that valve body would take a whole day. Part of the reason was because that sprag in the back of that thing would come apart on some of those in the early year models that were made, and all that metal would get up in there and cause those valves to stick. And this is driveline class, remember? And when I had to take those out, you usually can get them out with a magnet, but the problem with that is these right here were aluminum, most of them, and you can't get them aluminum to stick to a magnet. So you got some issues with that. All right, so all these valve bodies were, we didn't throw a lot of valve bodies on them in those days. But that right there was, lots of fun. That brings back a lot of memories, looking at that, valve body right there. Well, swapping the Tempo ATX went well, although the transmission was 4 years older than the car. He sent us a 90 model for a 94. And one problem he ran into was that the 90 model inboard CV joints were a different spline size on both ends. So basically we had some issues with that, different size. I got the, one and the other over here, the 94 and the 90 model didn't work. You remember the problem we had with Toyota? See the different size right there? How that spline's a different size over there, and that one over there is too. So that was kind of nasty. We had to call the salvage yard, and he brought us some CV axle that would fit it, so we wouldn't have to sell those. Now there's the pump end of that thing. There's the dipstick. There's the pan on the top where the valve body is and all that. The 94 half shafts wouldn't fit it in the 90 model transaxle, so he sent us the ones that fit it, and so on and so forth. All right, so the replacement transaxle worked flawlessly, but with all the other noises coming out of the way, we were now hearing a nice steady engine knock. Transmission was working fine, but we're hearing the engine going pop, 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 pop. Okay, now what's usually wrong with an engine whenever it knocks? Huh?
So it got a low oil pressure,
Or
rod bearings wore out, or main bearings wore out.
something like that. So we were looking at And if I was thinking it might be a rod bearing, what would I do in order to isolate that? And minimal, I don't wanna do anything really invasive right now, I just wanna go ahead and just check and see which one of these is, which rod's knocking.
Pull the fan off.
But you can, but not quite yet. Let's kill the cylinders one at a time
Oh, yeah,
until it
yeah.
changes the sound of the knock, you know, so on and so forth. All right, so we're hearing the engine knock. Yeah, this is another thing right there. That's Rachel put a slide in there. Well, incidentally, there's how those things went to work together. See that thing right there with bouncing that ball? I just wanted to make sure you saw that. All right, now let me get past that. We messed up on that. Incidentally, let me go ahead. She got the slides all out of order on this thing, but that's okay. I'll tell the story in a screwed up fashion, right? These bearings right here was where the ball came from. Right there. All right, and the bearing on the other side had lost some plastic, but the balls were all still in place. We did this kind of quick this morning. Well, the student's bill was already climbing, but we couldn't let that engine knock pass. We basically had to have the engine to where it would not knock. Okay, so we checked the oil pressure, found out it was a little bit low, but not to the point that it should have been causing the engine knock. What's oil pressure, what's acceptable oil pressure?
40 or 25 and up.
On a Chevrolet, say anything above 8 pounds.
Now, if it's basically the rule of thumb, and write this down, keep it the conventional wisdom is 10 PSI per 1,000 RPM. If it's idling, you can have 10 PSI. You can actually, well, you said 8 pounds if it's idling, you know, about 800 RPM would be about right. So basically at 2,000 RPM it ought to have 20, at 3,000 it ought to have, now some of them, if it's nice and healthy, will have 45, 50 pounds idling. And I like that personally. You know, I put an engine in a 72 Torino one time that was a used engine, and that thing had like 80 pounds of oil pressure just sitting there idling. And it was, you know, it was a high mileage engine too. Anyway, so a couple of the students yanked the engine oil pan off, which wasn't that hard on that car. It's pretty easy to get the oil pan off on the Tempo. And we did an inspection. The main bearings looked fine, but rods number 1 and 2 had hammered their bearings out thin. Now 3 and 4 didn't look that bad, but 1 and 2 were pretty. And that would mean the oil pressure was low because it was leaking past, you know, those bearings and all that. Now we found the specs in the book and all that. And we used a micrometer, and we found out as we mic'd that crankshaft that it was standard. There was no wear. All the wear was on the bearings, and the crankshaft was like really, really nice. And so we said, well, why don't we just put a set of bearings in there and an oil pan gasket and see what that does. Bearings don't cost that much. And so we put some bearings in there. We installed a new set of rod bearings, not main bearings, we just put rod bearings in it. And plastic gauged them to find nice healthy numbers. You're supposed to have like, you know, 1/1000th of an inch oil clearance, 1 to 1.5, you know, 1,000th to 1.5,000. You got more than that, you're gonna hear racket. But anyway, they had good numbers, so we put the oil pan up and fired it up. The oil pressure was 50 PSI at hot idle. Good strong oil pressure, quiet running engine. She had mounts on there that were good, so the engine and the transmission wasn't trying to flip over and jump out of the car now. She had a quiet engine, she had a transmission that worked good. Now, you know, granted, the rest of the car was kind of crummy looking, but everything was totally different. As far as the powertrain, we had really done a heap of good work on that, you know. Got her going. And you could drive the car, and it drove as good as just about any car you want to drive. You put it in gear, nice and crisp, it go through the gears and all that stuff. But it always feels good to do that, doesn't it? When you get one put back together and the flywheel ain't making noise anymore, and you got the heat shield put on the motor mount that you couldn't figure out where it went there for to start with, and all that kind of thing. That's just really terrific, isn't it? All right, so now this is the kicker. This is the kicker. And he thinks I didn't see him, doesn't he? All right. So, all right. She paid her bill at the front office, $700, and she drove away with this smooth running little machine. We fixed that. We fixed her rod bearings. We fixed her engine knocked for $65. You know. Of course, that when I told her about Patty, I pull that Volkswagen bug engine apart and put rings in it for $45. You know, because it all depends. You know, whatever you're going to do here. So the engine must have felt like, I said, this has to feel like a totally different car. Because when you were driving off before, it felt like, you know, you were, Armageddon was happening or something. Blah, 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 he was bopping around all over the place. And it was like, you could just hear it. Wasn't he missing on his shoulder and all that? So it's gonna last her. So we'd repair the engine knock for $65. The car ran and drove really well. Our bill was $700. Now watch this. A few days later, one of my guys saw her climbing in her car in the student center and asked her how she liked the job we did on it. You know, so I mean, she was driving the car, and he was one of the guys that worked on it. He was real proud of his work and still running really good. You know, we saw her go driving by several times. You see her go by over there? And she said, I liked it better the way it was before. Okay, what was she expecting? That's what she said. That was her answer. I liked it better the way it was before. She fires up the car, right after she told him this, and he stands there and he watches her drive off, and it's running like a brand new car. You know, I liked it. I don't know if she was just playing head games or if she was just being hateful. I don't know. You don't ever know what motivates some people. That was a confusing remark because we had seen her driving the car, and from the sound of it, everything was still doing good. I mean, this thing was falling apart when we started on it. I don't know what you're gonna do on that. So, come on, cheap batteries. What did it take to satisfy her? I know, but there's one thing I know all just about all my career is that you have no control over what somebody likes and what they don't like. You know, she chose not to like it, you know. But you basically, whenever you're doing something like that, you got to have a really good idea about, I mean, you know what's right and you know what you did, what was right, and you didn't sell her anything you didn't want. And we're hearing a lot of spooky stuff out here nowadays about these people at various different shops around there. Like anytime you hear a shop say, and this is a true story, with an air conditioning problem. This lady, and you may have heard this before, but I'm going to touch back on air conditioner for a second. This Altima comes in and she called me. She says, my car air conditioner quit and I went to such and such a place over here and they sent a guy out there with a flashlight and he checked a couple of fuses and said, we don't know what's wrong with it, but it'll probably be about $1,000. Anybody see a problem with that statement? We don't know what's wrong with it, but it'll probably be $1,000. So we got it over here and went into the line, going to the air conditioner. You know, I told you that the other day. And then that other lady, the other Altima, went to a different place in a different town, and they told her it needs a compressor and it'll be $1,000. And I said, why are they charging you $1,000 for a compressor? They said, well, she said 7 hours of it was labor. Well, all data says 0.7 hours or 0.8 hours is all the labor was to put it. So I don't know where they were getting their labor prices from. But how many people are actually getting overcharged?
They were taking a phone also, that's what it was.
Yeah, and so, well, that's what I'm saying, I'm trying to get rich on every job. And so I was telling this one guy one time that was talking about, he sent me an email and he says, I'm hearing a racket on my car. It's like sounds like a roaring sound or a rumbling sound in the front. And I said, okay, so let's see what that is. And so whenever I said swerve back and forth, I told him on the email, and if it changes when you swerve, and you know your tires are okay, then it's going to be probably a front wheel bearing. And so he says, okay, so I can do that. He was intelligent enough to understand what I meant when I told him that. So he said, I went to a shop. He went to a total strange shop that he had never been to before. And he says, and I told the guy I had a noise, and this guy started talking about, you know, this, that, and the other, and how much needed to be done, and how much it was going to cost, until I told him, I says, well, this is what I think it is. When I drove it and I swerved it, I could tell it changed when I swerved back and forth. You know, whenever I turned this way, it would load that bearing heavier, and I think we got a bad wheel bearing on the front. He says, after I told that guy that, he took me seriously, and he fixed my car for a good price. He says, I could tell before I started talking about what I had done to determine what was wrong with it. You know, he realized that I knew more than he thought I did. Well, see, what's wrong with that picture? See what I'm saying? Trying to take the guy for a ride. And have you got a story like that? You ever heard anybody do something like that? You ever heard of that? Heard somebody have experience in that?
Hi.
What about you? You ain't never heard of that?
My dad had a truck. They took it to this guy, and they had a body lift on it, and the fuel line was rubbing against the exhaust manifold. But the guy didn't tell him until like after he done got the car back, or the truck back and drove it and all that.
But it just so you're saying,
Yeah.
and the fuel lines.
Fuel line ruptured and all that stuff. There was this lady that came over here one time, I went to church with her growing up as a kid. She's an old gray-haired, blue gray-haired lady, and she had a relative that I also knew that worked for the state some kind of way. But anyway, he brought her old Buick over here, and he said she had stopped at a shop over there in another town, and it was running terrible, and you couldn't hardly drive it. It was kind of felt like this tempo, and so they put a fuel filter on it. And she drove away on it with it leaking fuel and didn't know it until she stopped and there was a big puddle of fuel somewhere and she was afraid to drive it. So she called the place that had just worked on it. You know, and I think they charged her, I don't remember whether they charged her to put a fuel filter on it. And then they sent a wrecker to pick it up. They hauled it back to their shop, made her pay for the wrecker bill, and also made her pay them for fixing the fuel leak they made. That's how she wound up over here. See what I'm saying? And so she comes over here, the chem sensor was bad, which was strange because the chem sensor was making the intake hot, you know, for some strange reason. I was thinking it had EGR flow, but it didn't. The chem sensor, when we put a chem sensor on there, smoothed out the way it was running. She had a tire that was probably shaped like an egg, because when you drove it down the road, just like this there. So we put 2 tires on it, and we basically put an ignition. Well, after that, we were driving it, and it ran a whole lot better after we put the chem sensor on it, and it was cutting, it seemed like we put plugs in it too, but it was still cutting out. And what we did on that was we took a timing lat and hooked it around one of the wires at the coil, you know, one of the coil back, and we brought it in there, we pointed it into the shadow in the floor and drove it, and every time it would cut up, that timing light would quit flashing, and so it had an ignition module problem, so we put an ignition module on and fixed that. Well, the tires were the most expensive part of the whole repair, and she drove away okay, but the thing about it is this other lady that she goes over there and she says, I need a door handle put on my Nissan Sentra, and the place she took it to says the door handle's $45 and it's $350 labor to change it. And she was blind, but she wasn't dumb, so she says, well, I think I'll just buy the door handle and get it put on somewhere else. And they say, hey, we'll give you a discount on the labor if you'll let us put the door handle on. You know, $350, put a door handle on. So she brought it over here, one of my guys put it on in about 20 minutes, and he had never even done it. You know what I'm saying? Remember what I was telling you about in air conditioning? Don't try to get rich off every customer. I'm not saying any of you guys would do that, you know, but.
I had a Bronco,
Yeah.
and something was wrong with the transmission. I can't remember what was on it first. And they just wanted a fluid change in it.
Yeah.
And they took it to this place, and they charged them so much money, and then when he drove away, it wasn't even shipped out of first gear.
Yeah.
And he took it back, he's like, look, it wasn't even shipped out of first gear. And then he wanted to charge him another like $600.
What year model?
8,
Now, some of them older Fords will do that, if the fluid ain't never been changed in it, you
That's
change the
what-
fluid, it won't ship.
Well, what happens is it's got a bunch of varnish all over the valves, and whenever you change the fluid, that new fluid washes that varnish, and pieces of it will get in there and cause the valves to stick. And sometimes that happens.
But it worked all right when he took it there, and then
Yeah.
when he got it back, it wasn't even shipped, and
Yeah.
they wanted to charge him again.
I took them
Yeah.
out before and put them back in, they weren't shipping them.
Yeah, that's a dicey thing. Well, my son took his vehicle. He was driving a 2000 Malibu, you know, one of the little cars with a quad 4 engine in it. So he took it to have an oil change done on it. And at the time he didn't, you know, he's got a house with a shop now, and he does all of his own oil changes and everything. But he took that car over there and they changed the oil. And while they were there, they added some more transmission fluid. Well, it's one of those kind that has got the plug on the bottom you take out when you crank it up. Whenever it's warm, you ought to stick your screwdriver in there and fill fluid. And they just screwed the thing, you know, it doesn't even have a dipstick, that's what I'm saying. And they just screwed the red cap off the top and poured a bunch of transmission fluid in, apparently. And so he told me, he says, when he called me, he says, Dad, I went and had my oil changed over here, because he worked at a tire store for 5 years before he went in the Navy. You know, so he kind of understood this stuff. He said that whenever I drove away, my car wouldn't hardly go over 40 miles an hour. And I said, they must have added some transmission fluid to it. He said, well, I didn't tell them to. And he said, I don't know why they would have done that. And I said, well, you don't ever know what they're going to do. And he said, well, he looked at their work order. He said, well, they charged me for some transmission fluid. And so he went back to the guy and said, what's up with this? You know, how come I'm getting charged for transmission fluid? I didn't need any. The guy said, well, you know, we wouldn't have put it in there if we didn't need it. So he goes to his house and he finds a place he can jack it up, and he puts some jack stands under it, and he cranks it up, and with the engine running, he takes that plug out and he drains about 1.5 to 2 quarts of fluid out of it. And Then he put the plug back in there after the fluid went down to where it was supposed to be, and he drove it and it ran like a new car. I mean, so why do they do this? You know, and there was this other guy that came the other day,